thank you for the invitation, Richard. And as Richard said, I am a former NHS doctor. I'm now the CEO of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, which I co-founded in October 2020 in response to the unethical COVID policies. And we campaign on all issues relating to medical ethics. So I think you will probably agree, COVID was a pandemic of ethical violations. And not just in relation to the vaccine rollout, as we heard this morning in the absolutely harrowing stories. Across the board, decisions were made in a moral and ethical vacuum. And people have been traumatised by the cruelty and harm that resulted, and understandably many want to forget, but we must not forget. This needs to be brought into the light to ensure that it never happens again. I'm also part of the People's Vaccine Inquiry convened by UK MFA, HEART, Perseus and the Children's COVID Advisory Council. And we all applied for and were refused core participant status in the Module 4 of the UK COVID Inquiry on vaccines. But Baroness Hallett asked us to provide witness statements, which we submitted in January 2024. However, they then postponed this vital module, so we felt that the huge amount of evidence that we had collectively compiled was too important to be hidden from the public. So in May last year, we launched the People's Vaccine Inquiry, along with concerned clinicians from Doctors for Patients UK, and we've published our witness statements and presentations on a dedicated website. Following the Module 4 hearings, which were finally held last month, the People's Vaccine Inquiry team held a press conference in London, and we presented vital evidence and the unasked and unanswered questions which had not been covered by the inquiry. And from the opening statement of Hugo Keith KC, who was the lead counsel for the inquiry, it was clear this was not going to be an objective assessment of the COVID vaccines and rollout. Instead, they sought to establish that the rollout was a resounding success and that vaccine injury, while real and regrettable, is very rare. In short, it was a whitewash. The failure of the inquiry to even address or ask fundamental questions about the ethics of the COVID vaccine rollout was a travesty. Vital questions weren't asked, such as whether the policies and decisions made were morally right or in accordance with long-established principles of medical ethics, or whether the vaccine should have been rolled out at all, given the lack of safety data, and let alone to pregnant women or those least at risk, such as children. It remains to be seen whether the Scottish inquiry will cover these ethical questions. Now, we were very pleased that 3 groups representing the COVID vaccine injured and bereaved were designated core participants, and this included the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group, represented admirably by Ruth O'Rafferty. And they are also core participants in the Scottish inquiry, where she will testify later this year. The lengthy witness statements and oral testimonies of Ruth O'Rafferty, along with Kate Scott, Charlotte Crichton, and their impressive KC Anna Morris, described harrowing stories of thousands injured or bereaved by the COVID jabs, the stigmatisation they have suffered, the financial hardship and broken relationships, the failure of the vaccine damage payment scheme to award timely compensation, and the complete failure of MHRA's yellow card scheme as post-marketing safety surveillance. Regrettably, the testimony of the vaccine injured groups was heavily controlled and constrained. The Scottish Vaccine Injury Group subsequently published a statement saying, "In our view, vaccine safety was not adequately considered, and the way Ruth O'Rafferty was questioned did not allow our voices to be heard." Where have we heard that before? So we hope and pray that she will be given a much broader scope to put across her well-researched evidence and points in the Scottish inquiry. So, the failure to apply wisdom or restraint in the rollout of COVID jabs has resulted in unprecedented numbers of injuries and deaths reported to the MHRA. This is the smoking gun. It is beyond belief that this yellow card data, now nearly a year old, was not considered to constitute a grave safety signal and trigger an immediate halt to the rollout. And on this slide, you see the stories of the human face of the suffering and death evidenced in the appalling yellow card data, the collateral damage from the reckless rollout of a brand new technology. They believed the government rhetoric that the vaccines were our only way out, were safe and effective, that we should trust the science, and that their vaccine would protect others. They trusted in their doctors and health authorities, who have grossly failed in their duty to protect the public from dangerous products. And they also believed that they would be looked after if anything went wrong. The gaslighting and abandonment of the vaccine injured and bereaved by the authorities and wider society is shameful, and it is well past time for them to get recognition, justice, and compensation. But the biggest tragedy of all is that this harm was entirely avoidable and would never have happened if the authorities and healthcare professionals had simply stuck to the core ethical principles that have always framed and constrained the delivery of healthcare. The arrogance of the authorities and their failure to consider the wider costs of their actions has had devastating and life-changing consequences for so many. It is indisputable that medical ethics were egregiously violated during the rollout. These principles uphold the equal value and dignity of every person and their right to freely decide what happens to their body. Principles of beneficence to do good, non-malfeasance to do no harm, autonomy and justice. They hold healthcare professionals accountable and protect vulnerable patients from abuse. All medical interventions carry a risk of harm, so there is a duty to act with care and proportionality. Ethical medical practice uses a patient-centred model, where the doctor's primary duty of care is to their patient, acting in that patient's best interests and maintaining privacy and confidentiality. There is a legal and ethical requirement that informed consent must be obtained for all medical interventions, after a full disclosure of risks, benefits, and alternatives to treatment. This consent must be freely given without coercion. Every single one of these requirements were violated in the COVID vaccine rollout. And medical ethics are enshrined into UK and international laws and declarations, the NHS Constitution, and professional codes of practice, meaning they cannot just be discarded in an emergency. In a crisis, decisions are often fear-driven, making abuse more likely. We must therefore always resist the urge to override individual autonomy for the greater good. And there is now overwhelming evidence that the COVID vaccines are neither safe nor effective. But this was, in fact, entirely predictable by the end of 2020, before the jabs were authorised. At this time, using information readily available in the public domain, UKMFA warned the authorities of serious safety and ethical concerns around the COVID vaccines and rollout in this 14-page fully referenced open letter. We urged them to delay authorisation, but sadly to no avail. But regardless of their safety profile, the COVID jabs should never have been rolled out in the way they were, or even at all. What were the authorities thinking? They set out to vaccinate every person in the country as quickly as possible, regardless of their individual risk. This completely new gene-based technology, with only 2 months of safety data, think about that, 2 months, was rolled out not just to those most at risk from COVID, but to those at little or no risk, including children and pregnant women, and even to those who had had COVID and recovered. You don't need to be a doctor or scientist to recognise that this defies common sense, as well as disregarding normal medical practice. and the appalling and unprecedented use of bribes, coercion, mandates and vaccine passports were a gross violation of medical ethics. This was a reckless gamble by the authorities with the lives and health of billions of people. The devastating stories of the vaccine injured and bereaved are evidence that this terrible gamble failed. Catastrophic and avoidable harm has resulted from the unethical rollout of these insufficiently tested products. Some may claim that we had no choice due to the threat from COVID, although I think after this morning, no one will be arguing that here, but we always have a choice, and the choices that were made were unwise and unethical and should never have been allowed. The failure of the authorities to implement the precautionary principle was staggering. Never before has a pharmaceutical product, still in clinical trials, been administered to children and pregnant women on such a mass scale. With only a few months of safety data available, the MHRA could not rule out long-term negative effects on health or fertility. Therefore, the regulators were authorising blind, playing fast and loose with millions of lives, and using children as human shields by vaccinating them to protect granny can only be described as evil. It's arguable that no one gave legally valid, fully informed consent to these products, which unbelievably were often given by volunteer non-medics in car parks. There was a complete lack of transparency and honesty from government and public health. Benefits were grossly overstated and risks were downplayed or denied. And the 2021 vaccine mandates imposed on care workers crossed the line into overt medical tyranny. Where there is risk, there must be choice. This extreme form of coercion led to 40,000 UK care workers leaving their profession. And sadly, many others accepted a vaccine against their will to keep their job. People were not given sufficient information to give fully informed consent. How many people do you think were told these essential facts before having their jab? I'll just let you have a quick look at them. Coercive messaging, bribes, fear-mongering and even lies were used to pressure and shame people into acting against their best interests and accepting a jab that they may not have wanted or needed, invalidating informed consent. The vaccinated were pitted against anti-vaxxers, dividing marriages, friendships, families and communities. Policies to address vaccine hesitancy undermined individual autonomy and the right to free medical choice. The term anti-vaxxer was used to shut down legitimate questions and concerns, and many took the jab under false pretenses, believing that it would protect others, an outright lie. The images on this slide should horrify us all. How did we let this happen? Students were put under intolerable pressure to accept vaccines, told their only way back to normal was with a jab. Vaccine centres were deployed at music festivals to capture young people, and nightclubs banned the unvaccinated. And we should be outraged at the unethical psychological techniques used to persuade our youngest children to demand the jab, like this NHS superhero campaign. This surely shows how far we strayed as a society from sober, responsible medical practice. Healthcare is big business. An ethical doctor is the only protection a patient has from a one-size-fits-all, dehumanised public health system, and from the powerful vested interests of Big Pharma, who drive policies and put profits before individual well-being. Regrettably, most of the medical profession was silent in the face of unethical COVID policies. They failed in their moral, ethical and legal duties to protect their patients from dangerous products and to obtain valid consent for vaccination. The few ethical doctors who voiced vaccine safety concerns were ruthlessly persecuted and censored by the NHS and GMC, investigated, sacked, or struck off. It's very dangerous when doctors can't uphold their professional duty to raise patient safety concerns, or use their clinical skills to treat patients in the way they judge best. Doctors who can't act autonomously and ethically become mere agents of the state. So where do we go from here? Well, COVID has set a dangerous precedent, normalising the unethical. We are hurtling down a slippery slope of increasing state overreach into individual healthcare. Politicians and bureaucrats have no place in the practice of medicine on individuals. We must return to Hippocratic, ethical, patient-centred medicine, upholding the equal value and dignity of all, and minimising the use of top-down, one-size-fits-all protocols written by distant health bureaucrats. Ethical doctors and whistleblowers must be shielded from persecution by the healthcare system and regulators. We must re-establish a clear ethical boundary to prevent the state abusing its power to force medical treatment on an individual, ensuring that the power of the state in any future health emergency is restricted, not expanded. Governments must never again be allowed to mandate medical treatments at all, but particularly to access basic human rights such as employment or travel. Individual rights and medical ethics must be firmly upheld in all circumstances. And there must be justice for the vaccine injured and bereaved. As a society, we have a moral duty to provide proper care, support and compensation for the appalling and unnecessary harm they have suffered. In conclusion, the catastrophic rollout from the COVID vaccines is arguably the biggest avoidable public health disaster in human history, and in my view constitutes a crime against humanity. All who were I'm glad you agree. All who were responsible must be held accountable, including facing trial if indicated. The rollout must be halted immediately tomorrow. And with hundreds more mRNA vaccines in the pipeline for infectious diseases and cancers, we need an immediate suspension of this dangerous failed technology. We must ensure this never happens again. Thank you.